5 things Anne Rice taught me about horror, both as a reader and an author. Number 1, horror is the hell that you exist in. Horror is as much about the self and what's inside as it is about what's happening to you. And horror doesn't have to be teeth and claws to be terrifying. Good horror can be as simple as good versus evil. And number 5, we love dark stories. They're part of our nature, they're part of our shared culture, our shared heritage. Horror can be the hell that you exist in. For example, I first read Interview with the Vampire in 2023. I'd seen the TV adaptation, and I'd seen the film ages ago, but I just thought now's the time to read the book, especially if I try and call myself a horror author. And I'd already seen those, thought they were great. But what Rice taught me was that horror can be as simple as the hell you have to exist in. Look at the character of Louis, Louis de Pointe-du-Lac. He is the most tragic, tortured soul that you're going to find in a vampire novel. Louis is isolated from a world he once knew, so mortality. And he just shows us what it's like to experience true, unfiltered loneliness. And it's the kind of loneliness that you find when you realise it's just you against the world, and there's no clear place where you fit in. Horror being the hell that you exist in is actually a really common feature across the Gothic genre in particular. Now, this could be trapped women in isolated castles. It could be ghosts cursed to linger there for eternity, maybe for something they've done. It could be husbands with dark secrets that they'll take to the grave before they get discovered. And creatures who are cursed to endure suffering, and it might be suffering that they've brought upon themselves, but usually it's suffering they haven't brought upon themselves. So if you think about Frankenstein's monster, the creature, he was just created and then he was cursed, essentially. Some titles that might come to mind here is Jane Eyre, The Castle of Otranto, The Woman in Black, and of course Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Well, the idea of Louis is nothing new when it comes to this kind of character, a Gothic character, a tortured soul. This is the first time, I think, that we've had a first-person point of view of the tortured creature or the tormented vampire, a character who is grappling with a new existence of life in the shadows. Other characters we've seen that kind of have this experience are, of course, Frankenstein's creature and the Phantom in The Phantom of the Opera. They live on the fringes of society, they live on the outskirts, kind of hidden away, and they look in on humanity, they look in on how normal people live their lives, and it's a world that they want to be part of. But they can't because of how they've been made or how society has treated them, for example. And this is the case of horror being the hell that you exist in. So, although, like in The Phantom of the Opera, Christine and Raoul were insufferable, Eric, you felt a little bit sorry for, but I think if it had been told by his point of view, it would have been a lot more interesting to see how that character perceives the world around them. But horror being the hell that you exist in, that is something that is also really common in the female Gothic. So if you think of Jane Eyre, the anonymous narrator in Rebecca, if we think of Estella and Great Expectations, or Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, this kind of isolation or being trapped within four walls and that being your whole world is a common feature of the female Gothic. These characters must find a way to live within that and navigate it. And I think that's why it was really interesting that Anne Rice chose to look at this from a male character's point of view, but from a vampire's point of view as well. And it's also a theme that comes up time and time again. I recently read Night Bitch by Rachel Yoder, and that definitely explores the isolation and the kind of loss of self and having to navigate in a world that you don't recognize because it's so different from the one that you came from. And there's levels of, the loss of self and Heathcliff levels of wildness that are clawing out to get into the character's public persona, but for whatever reason they are locked away, and that is the hell they have to live in. So that is one of the things that Anne Rice taught me about horror, both as a reader and a writer. Something else Anne Rice taught me about horror is that horror can be just as much about what is happening inside you and what is happening to you as it can be about the things happening outside. And while creature features are usually about like rabid dogs, killer sharks, killer rats, horror that happens inside you can be just as scary. Anne Rice explores this through the character of Louis de Pointe du Lac in Interview with a Vampire. Louis faces an internal battle where he has to come to terms with the monster inside him and what the monster wants. I think having to live with yourself is something that comes up a lot in fiction, but in Anne Rice's case with Louis, it's the horror of having not just to live with yourself or what you are, but it's about having to live forever. I don't think in Interview with a Vampire, being a vampire is particularly glamorized in any way. I think it's very much looked at some kind of eternal state of purgatory, and there might never be a solution. But Louis he's disgusted with himself. He's got self-disgust and he needs to find something that anchors him to the world. I think his self-disgust is actually like one of the most compelling things about him. Louis having to try and find his place in the world and trying to find his desire, trying to act on his desire for love, belonging. That can be a metaphor for maybe things that you've brought on yourself or regrets you have to live with. It's like Louis has to live with them forever. Interview with a Vampire is one of my favourite books. Certainly as a horror author, I think the deep sympathy we feel for Louis it just stayed with me, and that is what is happening inside you and what you are and coming to terms with who you are is definitely something that Anne Rice taught me about horror. Another thing Anne Rice taught me about horror, both as a reader and an author, is that teeth and claws aren't actually always necessary to tell a good horror story or to make something scary. Sometimes it's very much a case of what you can't see that's terrifying, and what's ahead of you. Is there anything ahead of you? Can you even see where things are going? Something I see a lot in Catholic horror in particular is that there's a great unknown and it's very difficult to prove that something doesn't exist. That comes up a lot. And what's worse, you can't prove that it's not there. Is the exorcism truly over? Is the ghost really gone? Though there's some encounters with some animalistic vampires in Interview with the Vampire, the terror is actually the eternal darkness and the abyss that Louis doesn't have the strength to free himself from. He's got this like bottomless pit inside him that can never be filled. And the novel particularly made me think of how awful it would be to have to live forever and you just crave blood. You can never live a normal life. But that is definitely one thing that Anne Rice taught me about horror. Teeth and claws are not always necessary to tell a good horror story. Something Anne Rice taught me about horror is that sometimes a good horror story can be as simple as good versus evil. This is a case of it's an old one, but it's a good one. And the battle between good and evil comes up a lot and it will endure. Like, we're always going to see books about the battle of good versus evil. That's not a bad thing. And whether the author is of a religious mindset or not, I think the battle between good versus evil is something that is unique to all of us as humans. It's not unique to religion at all. It's just unique to us. Anne Rice taught me that good horror can be all about morality. It can just be about knowing right from wrong and trying to kind of restore balance. People have shown time and time again a great capacity to embrace or act out evil, but they've also shown that good can prevail. And we want to believe it can. We want to believe that compassion wins in the end. And that's why we love like superhero films and tearjerkers and disaster films. Good versus evil has been explored by authors since humans first started telling stories around the campfire. And one of the oldest texts that we actually have in English literature is Beowulf, which is quite simply good triumphant over evil, man defeats the monster, hero defeats the creature, and so on. But Anne Rice definitely taught me that you can write a good horror book that just focuses on good versus evil. We love dark stories, we absolutely love them. They're part of our shared experience as people, and definitely in the Western world, we've got a lot of folk tales and fairy tales that are actually quite dark. Speaking for the Western sphere of literature, dark stories are part of us. We only have to look at like fairy tales, folk tales, and even mythology, Greek mythology. We see that the forest or the dark or the unknown, it's something to be afraid of. Don't go into the forest alone. Don't steal cabbages from the witch's garden. There's plenty of horror tropes lurking within a 19th century fairy tale. Dante, Shakespeare, Marlowe, Milton, they were all giving us dark tales even before we categorised them. Frankenstein, Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights all showed us a dark side that we couldn't look away from because it's part of us. Human emotions and suffering make a story dark. So think of like Miss Havisham in Great Expectations. Our own personal sense of pain and grief and regret and loss. She takes all that on board, doesn't deal with it, but instead she tries to basically have Estella and Pip lose their innocence by being cruel or cold or to hurt Pip's feelings, and she gets a kick out of that. And if we think of Wuthering Heights, we've got Cathy and Heathcliff. They get a kick out of tormenting each other. And people say, oh, that's a love story. But it's actually, it's about a cycle of grief and torment and trauma. And Anne Rice taught me that it's natural to want to explore the darker sides of the soul. And it's definitely what horror is about for me. Anne Rice actually said that dark stories have been part of our literature for a very long time. She also says that a great horror story or a dark story can be quite transformative. It can take us to a different place. It can give us experiences that we might never have had otherwise. And it can also help us process quite dark or traumatic things in a safe space. She says that dark stories require a certain level of suffering so that the audience can achieve eventual affirmation. Anne Rice taught me a lot about horror. She has inspired my own work. Horror can be sensual, like in Ramses the Damned. It can be internal. It can be about the spiritual journey and the battles along the way. Rice taught me about the spiritual quest more than any horror author I have read. Follow me for more about horror.